Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've brewed around, Neriv, Heart of the Storm. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but as this is a list price, this doesn't include costs such as shipping. Anyway, Neriv, Heart of the Storm, is a 4/5 legendary spirit dragon with flying, costing a generic, a red, a white, and a black to cast, and has it so if a creature you control that entered the battlefield that turn deals damage, it deals twice that damage instead. Which basically just pushes for a fairly aggro deck where, once you have Neriv out, you're looking to get creatures out and swinging, which we can achieve through a few ways. Obviously, creatures with haste will fit right at home here, especially if they come packed with some evasion, but we can also look for sources of creature tokens that are created tapped and attacking, or we could use Myriad or a few other ways to get creatures to deal damage the turn that they enter. But it's not exactly a complex strat needing massive discussion, so let's get digging into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. We'll start with Wayfarer's Bauble, which can be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and then Arcane Signet and Ornithopter of Paradise can produce mana of any color we can need at the time. Felwar Stone is likely to tap for at least some of the colors we need, depending on what our opponents are playing and what lands they have down. And wrapping up with Rakdos, Boros, and Orzhov Signet, which can convert any 1 mana into 2 mana of the respective named color pairs. But with that, let's start going over the majority of our sources of creatures that can deal damage the same turn that they enter the battlefield. Starting with a few Phoenixes, with Phoenix Chick being a 1/1 hasty flyer that can't block, but can be returned to the battlefield from the graveyard with a +1/+1 counter on it if you pay 2 red whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures. Flamewake Phoenix is a 2/2 hasty flyer that attacks each combat that it can and can be returned to the battlefield for 1 red at the beginning of your combat on your turn if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, such as our commander. And Othari, Sun's Glory, is a 3/3 hasty flyer with lifelink that gives you an experience counter whenever it attacks, and then you make a 2/2 red rebel creature token that's tapped and attacking for each experience counter that you have, which for 4 mana and tapping an untapped rebel you control, you can return Othari to your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Moving on though, we have Hell's Thunder, a 4/4 flyer with haste that gets sacked at the beginning of your next end step, while Ball Lightning and Lightning Skelemental are 6/1s with trample and haste that also get sacked at the beginning of their end step, but for Skelemental, if a player is dealt damage by it, they discard 2 cards. Blazing Spectre is a 2/2 with flying and haste that has the players dealt combat damage from it to discard a card. And then Rakamar and Loyal Apprentice are both hasty creatures that have ways to make hasty creature tokens. The former can be tapped with 1 red to make a 3/1 red elemental creature token with haste, and the latter makes a 1/1 colorless Thopter creature token at the beginning of your combat if you control your commander, with that Thopter gaining haste for the turn. Now moving away from creatures with inherent haste, Lagomos, Hand of Hatred, makes a 2/1 red elemental creature token with trample and haste at the beginning of your combat that you sack at the start of your next end step. And technically Lagomos can be used to tutor, but requires at least 5 creatures to die that turn. Avenger of the Fallen is a 2/4 with Death Touch and Mobilize X, with X being the number of creature cards in your graveyard, with Mobilize meaning that when that creature attacks, you make X tapped and attacking 1/1 red warrior creature tokens that you sack at the beginning of the next end step. Maniform Hellkite is a 4/4 with flying that makes an XX red dragon illusion creature token with flying and haste whenever you cast a non-creature spell, with X being the amount of mana spent casting that spell, though you exile the token at the beginning of the next end step. And Flame Rush Rider is a 3/3 that, when it attacks, you make a token copy of another target attacking creature that's tapped and attacking, of which that token is exiled at the beginning of the next end step. But Flame Rush Rider also has a dash cost, where, if cast for that cost, it gains haste and is returned to your hand at the beginning of the next end step, so through dash, both the Flame Rush Rider and the token it makes get value from Neriv's ability. Moving on from creatures, Mardu Ascendancy has you put a 1/1 red goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking onto the battlefield whenever a non-token creature you control attacks, and the enchantment can be sacked to give creatures you control 3 extra toughness for the turn. Urabrask's Forge gets an oil counter at the start of combat on your turn, and then it makes an X1 red Phyrexian horror creature token with trample and haste, with X being the number of oil counters on the Forge, with that token also getting sacked at the beginning of the next end step. And finally, Mimic Vat has Imprint, making it so whenever a non-token creature dies, not just our own creatures, you can exile it and return all the other cards exiled by Mimic Vat to their owner's graveyard. And then, for 3 mana, we can tap Mimic Vat to create a token copy of the exiled creature with haste that we exile at the beginning of the next end step. Though, as a word of caution if you plan on putting Neriv into the Vat, if Mimic Vat gets destroyed, the card that's exiled stays in exile. Now moving on, Myriad is a pretty useful keyword to have in this deck, as when a creature with it attacks, it makes a token copy of itself that's tapped and attacking for each opponent other than the player the original is attacking, with each copy attacking one of those other opponents, and with those tokens being exiled after combat. And for this we have some creatures that naturally have Myriad, with Hammers of Meriden, 3/3s that additionally, when they attack, you tap up to one target creature that player controls, Dalek Squadron, a 3/3 with Myriad and Menace, so it can't be blocked except by 2 or more creatures, and Elturel Survivors, 0/4s with Trample and Myriad, but when it attacks it gets +X+0, with X being the number of lands the defending player controls. And then we have Duke Alder Ravengard, a 5/5 that gives another creature you control haste and Myriad for the turn at the beginning of combat on your turn, and Blade of Selves, an equipment that gives its equipped creature Myriad. But now I'd like to go over a smattering of effects that didn't exactly fit into any of the main chapters in this deck, but still synergize with the game plan. Namely, Swiftfoot Boots, giving its equipped creature hexproof and haste, potentially a way to protect Neriv and use our commander's ability with our commander, which we can also get from Rising of the Day, giving all of our creatures haste, and our legendary creatures get an additional +1 power. Legion's Initiative gives our red creatures +1 power, and our white creatures +1 toughness, and then for 2 mana we can exile Legion's Initiative to exile all creatures we control, and then at the beginning of the next combat, you return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control, with them gaining haste for the turn, so a solid way to reset our board for Nerev's ability. And similarly, Nahiri's Resolve gives our creatures +1 power and haste, and at the beginning of our end step, we can exile any number of non-token artifacts and or creatures we control, which we return to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of our next upkeep, also letting us reset our board for Nerev's ability. Then Ilharg, the Raised Boar, is a 6/6 with Trample that, whenever it attacks, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking, of which you return that creature to your hand at the beginning of the next end step, and when Ilharg dies, or is put into exile from the battlefield, you can put it into its owner's library 3rd from the top. And finally for this part, Warstorm Surge has it so whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to a target creature or player. But let's shift gears and start going over our various sources of card advantage and draw. Starting with Sign in Blood and Foreboding Fruit, having a target player draw 2 and lose 2 life. Read the Bones, having you scry 2, draw 2, and lose 2 life. Dire Sight, having you surveil 2, draw 2, and lose 2 life. And Underworld Connections, which enchants a land and then gives that land the ability to be tapped while paying 1 life to draw a card. Phyrexian Arena simply has you draw 1 and lose 1 life at the beginning of your upkeep. And Mary, Esquire of Rohan, is a 2/2 with haste that, whenever you attack with Mary and another legendary creature, you draw 1. Though honestly this is probably one of the first cards I'd look to sub out from this section on upgrading, as with 2 toughness and a need to attack to get that draw ability, it isn't exactly the greatest long-term survival strat. Aurelia, the Law Above, is a 4/4 with flying, vigilance, and haste that has you draw whenever a player, not just us, attacks with 3 or more creatures, and when a player attacks with 5 or more creatures, Aurelia deals 3 damage to each of your opponents and you gain 3 life. Then there's Queen Marchesa, a 3/3 with Death Touch and haste that makes you the Monarch when Marchesa enters the battlefield, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, if you're not the Monarch, you make a 1/1 Black Assassin creature token with Death Touch and haste, where being the Monarch has you draw 1 at the start of your end step. And then moving off of hand growing card advantage, Ren's Resolve has you exile the top 2 cards of your library, which you can play until the end of your next turn. Demand Answers and Thrill of Possibility have you draw 2, but also have you discard a card to cast them, though Demand Answers does let you choose to sack an artifact instead of discarding a card as an additional cost of casting. And finally, Combustible Gear Hulk is a 6/6 with First Strike that, when it enters, a target opponent chooses to either let you draw 3 cards or mill 3 cards, and if they have you mill, Combustible Gear Hulk deals damage equal to the total mana value of cards milled that way to that opponent, which would be doubled if we have Neriv out. But after all that, let's move on to the various ways that we can interact with what our opponents are doing. To start, we have Doomblade to destroy a target non-black creature, Go for the Throat to destroy a target non-artifact creature, and Infernal Grasp to destroy a target creature, though you lose 2 life. Terminate also destroys a target creature, and it can't be regenerated. And Path to Exile exiles a target creature, though that creature's controller does get to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. Feed the Swarm lets you destroy a target creature or enchantment, though you lose life equal to that permanent's mana value. And Mortify lets you destroy a target creature or enchantment. Then Requisition Raid has Spree, letting you add mana to choose multiple modes, though modes can only be chosen once per cast. Letting you destroy a target artifact, destroy a target enchantment, and or putting a +1/+1 counter on each creature a target player controls. Disenchant lets you destroy a target artifact or enchantment. and a Braid lets you destroy a target artifact or deal 3 damage to a target creature. And Rakdos Charm lets you destroy a target artifact, exile a target player's graveyard, or have each creature deal 1 damage to its controller. Byforce is an X cost spell letting you destroy X target artifacts, while Stroke of Midnight lets you destroy a target non-land permanent, though its controller gets a 1/1 human creature token in return. Chaos Warp can be a bit of a risk, having the owner of a target permanent shuffle it into their library, and then that player reveals the top card of their library, and if it's a permanent that's revealed, they put it onto the battlefield. And finally, we have a couple of wipes with Cleansing Nova and Austere Command, the former having you choose between destroying all creatures and destroying all artifacts and enchantments, and then the latter having you choose 2 of 4 options, destroying all artifacts, all enchantments, all creatures with mana value 3 or less, or all creatures with mana value 4 or greater. But now that we've gone through all the spells in this deck, let's go over our land base. Starting with some land tutor lands with Shattered Landscape, tapping for generic, or it could simply be tapped and sacked to tutor a basic mountain, plains, or swamp onto the battlefield tapped. Promising Vein and Shire Terrace, which for 1 mana can be tapped and sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. And Myriad Landscape, which can be sacked to tutor 2 basic land cards of the same land type onto the battlefield tapped. Then Command Tower will tap for any color mana we can need, and the same goes for Nomad Outpost and Path of Ancestry, though these 2 enter the battlefield tapped. But Path of Ancestry lets you scry 1 if mana produced by it were spent casting a creature sharing a creature type with your commander. Then Exotic Orchard is basically Felwar Stone, the land, and as such will likely tap for at least some of our colors in a typical game. And then for some duels, we have Smoldering Marsh, a Rakdos land that enters untapped if you control 2 or more basic lands, Isolated Chapel, an Orzhov land entering untapped if you control a plains or swamp, and Clifftop Retreat, a Boros land entering untapped if you control a mountain or plains. And then we have Temple of Malice, Silence, and Triumph, dual tap lands that have you scry 1 when they enter the battlefield. And then for a bit of utility, Delkavan Encampment enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a mountain or swamp, but it produces white mana and can be used to make it so when you attack that turn, you make 2 1/1 red warrior creature tokens that are tapped and attacking, which you sack at the beginning of your next end step. Amonkhet Raceway, tapping for generic, has Start Your Engines, immediately giving you a speed of 1, which increases by 1 on each of your turns where an opponent loses life, with a max speed of 4, of which, at max speed, you can tap Amonkhet Raceway to give a target creature haste for the turn. Slayer Stronghold taps for generic, but can be used to give a target creature +2 power, vigilance, and haste for the turn. But aside from that, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 9 basic mountains, 5 basic plains, and 5 basic swamps, as this deck does somewhat lean more heavily on red than the other 2 colors. But now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing for just under $45 at the time of recording, which is including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but it is just a list price, so shipping and the like aren't included here. Now before I close out this video, I'd like to suggest a handful of upgrades you may wish to consider if you're looking to build this deck with a slightly higher budget. For ramp, you may wish to consider the 3 talismans, Conviction, Hierarchy, and Indulgence, with our color pairs over their respective signets, as the signets can't be tapped to simply produce mana themselves. For interaction, you may wish to consider some spell redirection, like Untimely Malfunction, Bolt Bend, Return the Favor, and Imp's Mischief, or including something like Tybalt's Trickery, a frankly wacky counterspell in red. A couple of additional damage amplifiers might be fun to slot in, such as City on Fire, Fiery Emancipation, and/or Gratuitous Violence. Or for this effect on a creature, there's Gisela, Blade of Goldenite, doubling damage done to our opponents and their permanents, but having the damage done to us and ours. Lightning Greaves could easily replace, or be included alongside Swiftfoot Boots to get our non-hasty creatures swinging on the turn they're down. Then Caesar, Legion's Emperor, and Zergo, Stormrender, are a couple more creatures that can consistently create creature tokens that attack the turn that they're created. While Mardu Siegebreaker has you exile a target creature you control when it enters the battlefield, which has you make a copy of that exiled creature for each opponent when Mardu Siegebreaker attacks, with that token copy tapped and attacking a different one of those opponents, though those tokens do get sacked at the end of your end step. And finally, for 2 hasty flyers, there's Inferno of the Starmounts and Goldspan Dragon, the former being a 6/6 with spicy fire breathing, and the latter being a 4/4 that makes treasure tokens whenever it attacks or becomes the target of a spell, and it makes your treasure tokens worth 2 mana instead of 1. But regardless, I should close out this video, so if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and maybe drop a sub if you'd like more of these kinds of videos in your feeds. That being said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.